Here we are at my 30-year survey at the Pete and Susan Barrett Gallery in Santa Monica. And I'm standing in front of a painting that I made back in New York City in 1986. It's called Veil of Time. And I actually began this series as far back as 1982, and I was mixing oil and water together to get these kind of galactic, explosive looking paintings. And I do them with either predominantly black with white into them, or predominantly white with black into them. So we're standing in one that's predominantly black, and they always tended to look galactic, microscopic, and yet they still related to the history of abstract painting and process-driven abstraction in particular, which I was always very interested in. So I feel like my interest in painting that started in the early 80s was to approach abstract painting and then start to reference things in nature or phenomenological things. And I was always interested in this kind of ambiguity where you were looking at an image and it wasn't entirely clear, but it suggested many things simultaneously. So I liked that kind of ambiguity, and that was sort of an entry point into my work. And this idea of setting up these kind of polarities, black and white, oil and water, abstract pictorial. Here we are in front of a painting that was done 1 year after the one we were just looking at. This painting is from 1987. It's called The History of Building. And I was interested again in doing these paint reactions, but now I was taping out little zones and then doing a reaction inside that zone and then taping out another zone, etc. And I wanted to make these things that looked very primitive, very kind of primordial. They could be rocks, they could be microscopic organisms. Again, that notion of ambiguity between different phenomenon and the ambiguity between abstract painting and representational painting. I always really loved the work of earth artists, land artists like Robert Smithson, Michael Heiser, Walter de Maria. This was my homage. I was working with something that was made in an organic way, and I was making these kind of primitive sculptures, though through painting, that suggested these kind of piles of rocks that were put up and yet were falling apart. So it was always this notion in my work of formation versus deterioration or disintegration. This is now 1988, and when I was living in New York City at the time, I was obsessed with the science section of the New York Times that came out every Tuesday, and I would read every week whatever the story was. And the stories were either galactic, microscopic, biological, or even sociological, kind of scientific stories that came out, and it was always the newest cutting-edge science. And that dichotomy always interested me because it was a newspaper, something you were supposed to throw away at the end of the day, and yet it was talking about these things on a kind of cosmic, grand cosmic scale. So I thought that was interesting. And I wanted to start to reference the paintings that I was doing that were made through chemical reactions, or paint reactions, if you will. And I wanted to reference in other types of things in the universe that are made. So this story on this side is about how 4 billion years ago, huge amounts of essential life, such as complex organic molecules, amino acids, rained down on the Earth through meteorites and asteroid bombardments, and life as we know it began. And then on the other side, it's talking about how natural chemicals are actually linked to disease, something called free radicals. So if you will, you have this kind of loop for the cycle of life on galactic as well as kind of microscopic scales taking place. So again, an ambiguous image that was made through paint reactions and then referencing in scientific stories that give you a way to look at what you're seeing and yet never quite still pinning down what's there. This is one of the earliest bodies of work that I made in Los Angeles after returning from New York. I'd lived in New York for 18 years prior, and I came back in 2000. I had a little shack in South Malibu, PCH, and I would drive to my Venice studio every day, up and down PCH at the beginning and the end of every day. And you see this kind of infinite vista of ocean meeting sky, and you see how much every moment of the day you have a new image based on the angle of the sun in proximity to the ocean and the sky. So you've got this constantly changing sort of seascape or landscape, if you will, or horizon. And I was interested in that notion of making a painting that felt very calm and yet suggested this constant change and this constant kind of play between water and sky. I made some later that very much felt like desert, so you get the same phenomenon there. These two different things reflecting off each other and creating this image that's constantly changing. The only constant is that you have this very thin beam of light at the horizon, and then everything sort of plays back and forth. In 2003 is actually when I started curving my canvases. First I made them convex, so they curved out the wall this way. And then by 2004, I was making them concave, like this painting here. So these concave paintings, they reference both the curvature of the earth, this notion of this kind of infinite horizon, but also very much Cinerama movie screens. And I'd seen 2001, A Space Odyssey, at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood when I was about 6 years old. And it was just a huge, huge influence on my life. So this painting is from 2011, and starting at around 2009, I stopped making paintings that were quite as reductive. I wanted to add these more kind of serpentine feeling lines and still create this sense of infinite space, and it's still on a concave canvas. So it still relates to this idea of Cinerama, and specifically 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the final sequence of the film, you feel like you're moving through this infinite space. You see a horizon, but not a horizon as we know. It's sort of a time horizon with bands of color above and bands of color below, and you're moving through this space. That notion always very much appealed to me, so I wanted to see if that's something that I could explore in paint. And then as you get towards the middle, everything gets tighter and tighter to where you literally have bands of color here that are no thicker than the head of a pin or a human hair. So it really creates this sense of illusion, motion, and even false horizon. You feel like you have a horizon and another and another. I've been doing the concave panels from about 2003 until 2014, and then it just felt natural to want to make a vertical curve, which I've done here. So it's curving this way rather than this way. And it's also parabolic, meaning it's getting narrower in the middle. It's got a 45-degree cutback at the edge. And when you have that and you've got something getting wider, you're just going to naturally create this parabolic shape like I have here. So it has that psychedelic notion of lots of information converging together. And your vision, you're seeing this sort of expanded landscape from left, right, center, up, down simultaneously. And again, wider banding of color at the top and bottom, and then getting to very, very precise detail in the middle. This is really the newest direction of my work. This was done late 2016. I did it specifically for this 30-year survey. It's called Geomorph 1504. And I'd been doing these sort of morphological shapes, if you will, that look like they could be a giant rock, it could be biological. So this was kind of a two-step process. I first made the entire background painting, if you will, and then I let that dry, and then I came back in with a whole nother core on top of it and manipulated this shape while it was flat to get all these details and all these kind of folds, if you will, suggesting this very physical kind of space against this background space that feels like it's receding.